Hey everybody, it's Charles from HumbleMechanic.com. Today I'm taking your questions on oil leaks, DSG failures, rear brakes, and more. This is episode 224 of the Humble Mechanic Podcast. The way to get a question on a show like this is to email me, charles@HumbleMechanic.com, and put question for Charles in the subject. Also, if you don't see your question on a show like this, be sure to check out the quick videos playlist where I do one question per video. And remember, there is an audio-only version of most of these videos available on iTunes, Stitcher, your favorite podcasting platform, or of course at HumbleMechanic.com. All right, let's talk about the sponsor of the day, which is CRP Automotive. CRP deals in a ton of OE maintenance and repair parts, so check them out at crpautomotive.com. And real quick, if you guys want discounts to places like Black Forest, Eastwood, MT Knives, Sonic, Tools, and more, hit that crew membership link down below and you can learn more about it there. That's all I'm going to talk about for today. Let's hit these questions. First one up comes from Taylor. How should I go about fixing my DSG transmission? Dealer suggested that I replace the entire transmission when I think it has a failing mechatronics unit. I have a 2007 GTI with 117K on it and recently had some issues with the DSG. Clunks a few times when putting it in a park, fell out of gear, and shifts hard sometimes. I get the flashing prindle a lot and it doesn't feel like it's disengaging the clutch completely when I come to a stop. I took the car to the dealer and they suggested a new/used transmission and didn't give me an option to fix it. They told me that it was the most reliable way to fix it. I have a feeling it's the mechatronics unit. I'm at a loss for words since a brand new transmission is about the same money as it is to sell my car. All right, Taylor, good question. So officially, there's about 3 repairs for a DSG transmission from the dealership. There is replacing the entire box, which, let's face it, takes care of a lot of and all the rest of the problems that the transmission may have. There is doing a mechatronics unit, which is the most common repair on those gearboxes. In fact, there was a recall or a campaign many years ago to replace those mech units. I remember doing them all day long at the dealership. And 3 is to put a new clutch pack in it. Typically, the clutch pack failure comes along with a fault as well as drivability concerns. And I'll tell you straight up why the dealership said to put a box in it. Okay, it's very simple. If they put a box in it, it's going to fix it. Unless we have some kind of wiring issue in the harness, the box is going to take care of it, whether it was the clutch pack, whether it was the mechatronics unit, the box will fix it. And that is in some ways a little bit of a lazy diagnosis, and in other ways a very safe thing to recommend, because if they, let's say, recommend a clutch pack, the clutch packs are worn out, which again typically comes with a fault, and the mech unit is maybe a little shaky, like maybe a little bit failing, but not completely smoked. If they do one, they still have the issue with the other one. And to do both of those repairs, you're probably going to spend more than it would be just to R&R a box. But what can you do as a customer to not have to buy a box, but also get your car fixed correctly? Well, this is a really challenging thing, and I think what we need to know is why the prindle is inverting. So the prindle, when it flashes or it changes direction, that's called an inverted prindle. That points to a fault stored in the TCM, or in the case of the DSG box, in the mechatronics unit. Before we can move an inch forward, we need to see what faults are stored. There's a lot of people that hate on today's cars or today's technicians because they can't fix anything without a scan tool. Why would you even try to fix something when you have the ability to look at the computer and see what it's seeing? We need to know what those faults are before we can do anything moving forward. The issue with falling out of gear is not a common mechatronics unit. The most common symptom of failing mechatronics unit is a harsh up 1 to 2, 2 to 3 shift, or a really harsh downshift from 4 to 3 or 2 to 1. There are other cases where it almost feels like from 1 to 2 it double shifts in between that gear, but that is, again, to me, that's just like a harsh 1 to 2 shift. And from what I remember, when you start to compare that failure to a clutch pack failure, the symptoms can be similar, but typically the behavior of the clutch pack is a little bit different depending on fluid temperature. So when it's warm, it may act a little bit better than when it's cold, or vice versa. When it comes to the mechatronics unit, it was typically this failed and had these symptoms almost every single time, and almost 0 times did a failing mechatronics unit come along with the fault. So what I would do before I spent any of this money is I would do a fluid service and make sure that the fluid and the filter is good and clean and at the proper level. then what I would do is I would do basic settings. If you have access to VAGCOM, OBD11, or another aftermarket scan tool, this is an opportunity to do the basic setting yourself. If you don't, jump on Facebook group and see if someone local has a VAGCOM, run basic settings 61 and 60 in that order, 61, then 60, and see if it'll relearn all of its positions and drive it again and see what happens. If you have one of these components that's failing, it may make it way worse and completely smoke it, okay? Just to give you a little bit of a warning. I don't think that's gonna happen, but it is a possibility. But that'll then tell you exactly which of the components you had bad. I would do that before I spent any more money. A DSG service is a very simple DIY. I've done a video walking exactly how to do it. I'll try and link that up for you to check it out. Do that, then move forward. Or another option is you can always take it somewhere else and get a second opinion. My guess is at almost 120K, you're gonna get most shops and almost every dealership telling you it's probably wise to put a box in it and solve any problem than it is to put a new part in a situation where maybe the other part does have a little bit of wear. Without driving it and experiencing it myself, there's zero possibility for me to know for sure which of the two it is, but that is the strategy I would take on getting it fixed. All right, next one up comes from Matt. Love the blog, videos, etc. And the new R is fantastic. Matt, it is fantastic. I have an '08 Passat 3.6 and I need to do rear brakes. I don't have VAGCOM and I'm wondering if you have what you think of the various tricks people do to bypass VAGCOM. I'm inclined to bite the bullet and go ahead and get the VAGCOM and a laptop since I only have Macs. Pretty skeptical about these shortcuts and I'm working on my own car, so I should probably have VAGCOM. Anyway, all right, so what Matt is talking about is on this generation, the B6 generation vehicles and the Tiguan and some of the newer Golf family cars, they have electronic rear parking brakes, which means that you can't just take the rear caliper off and spin it in like you can on every other car on the planet. You should, I shouldn't say you have to, but you need to use the computer to pull the motor back and then squeeze the caliper in. And this can be done in a handful of ways. The way we did it at the dealership was either, if guys had VAGCOM, they'd use that. I always liked to use the factory scan tool on cars at the dealership. That way, if something went sideways and the caliper got really upset and we ended up having to put a caliper on it, I could go to my boss and say, boss, look, I used the factory scan tool and this happened. We can't blame VAGCOM and then in turn blame me for that or some other method of doing it. I always use the factory tool. But most of you don't have access to that. So VAGCOM is a great way to do it. And yes, Matt, if you're gonna be DIYing stuff, I do think you should have VAGCOM. Since you run Macs, that's what I use too, you might wanna look at running VAGCOM off Boot Camp rather than buying another laptop. And I wish I would have thought of that when I emailed you back. But look into running it off Boot Camp so that you can run it off of your MacBook or whatever Apple product you have. There are also other options. You can look at OBD11, which is a much more affordable scan tool. It's just a little dongle that plugs in and software you put on your Android-only phone or tablet, which is the negative of that. Especially being an Apple person, I'm assuming you're gonna have an iPhone as well. But that's another option, and you can probably get the OBD11 and a cheap tablet for about what you'd spend on VAGCOM or probably less. You can also look at a variety of other aftermarket solutions. My Autel that I just got, I was playing around with the Tiguan and it does work. It will retract the calipers, but any of those options, you're spending a lot of money to do this. And really what you're doing is you're investing in your DIY capabilities, which I'm all for. I really do think if you are going to take your DIY seriously, you gotta have some form of scan tool. And if you're a Volkswagen owner, I think VAGCOM flat out is the best one. The way that other places do it, and I understand and I don't hate it, but I don't love it either, and you'll find out why at the end, is you can take the motor off, you can spin the caliper back and put the motor back on. Some people will 12 volt power the motor and retract it that way. I mean, these are very simple, stupid motors, right? 12 volts in the ground, power and ground one way, extends it, power and ground the other way, retracts it. People can do it that way, and it does technically work. The only problem with that is you can't force the basic setting, and you do run the risk of damaging the calipers. Some of those, especially you're in '08, so you're probably okay. Those like '06, '07 Passat calipers were finicky, and I know we damaged a couple trying to do brakes on them. doing it perfectly, scan tool, battery maintainer, and everything. So I'm a little reluctant to recommend doing it that way, but you can do it that way in a pinch if you have to. In fact, before the Tiguan goes back on lease, as long as you guys promise not to tell VW of America, maybe I'll show you how to do that so that in a pinch, you can do it, but I really don't recommend it. And again, it's not only risking damaging the caliper, it's risking and not having the ability to do the basic setting, which eventually will be performed anyway, but I really like when doing those brake jobs to force run it so that your brakes are 100% happy before you start driving the car. My recommendation, Matt, is almost always going to be bite the bullet, spend the money. I know it's a lot of money, but you can get one of the 3-VIN ones for like $200. I think it's worth every penny of it, especially if you're not needing unlimited VINs for what you're planning on doing. Highly recommend getting a scan tool. I'll try and link up Rostech. The website is ross-tech.com. You guys can go there. You can buy it through them. If you want to tell them I sent you, even awesomer. You don't get any discounts, and I don't get any credit for it, but I'm always trying to keep in good graces with the guys at VAGCOM. They do a lot of work for the VW community. They also have an amazing wiki page, so if you have a question on a fault and you're not sure, go to Rostech's wiki page because they break it down. They do a great job. Can't say enough good things about the work that the guys at Rostech do for us in the VW Audi community. All right, next one up is from Sergey. All new gaskets and compression test and still losing/leaking oil. I'm relatively new to the car scene. I owe a Mark V GTI with an FSI that has around 135,000 kilometers on it. I can't figure out where my oil is leaking from. I've replaced the diverter valve, the oil pan, the valve cover gaskets, and recently did a timing belt job, all done by a shop, not me. I know my engine and most of the gaskets are new. Is there something I'm missing? Would appreciate if you point me in the right direction. Car is consuming 1 liter of oil every 600 kilometers or so, which is a lot considering VW said it should consume that every 15 to 2,000 kilometers. Yeah, that's a lot of oil, man. Okay, so when it comes to losing oil to the universe in your engine, you need to figure out what's happening before we talk about a repair. Is it leaking? That means that the engine is in the oil's in the engine, and then it becomes outside of the engine externally. And we can see that. Start at the top of the engine and work your way down to the bottom. Oil and everything else, it leaks down. Now there may be some push of these fluids back because of air, and even sometimes you get a little higher than where the actual leak is due to air turbulence and things like that. But oil and coolant and brake fluid and power steering fluid all leak down. The BPYs were good at leaking at the valve cover, leaking at the oil filter housing, leaking at the oil pan, leaking at that back cover on the cylinder head that covers the timing chains. Those were the most common places for oil leaks. If it's not leaking, that means it's consuming. That means oil is being pulled in through the airstream somehow and pushed out the engine and burned, I should say. The things we want to look at here are PCV valve. There was a campaign on that in the US, and you're clearly not in the US, or maybe you are and just use kilometers, which is cool. There was a campaign in the US to replace the PCV valve. It also replaced the pipe with a check valve that comes off the turbo, another place where oil was typically consumed. It was very uncommon on the transverse engines with the GTI, with the Passat, with the GLI, and even on the Audi A3 side, to have oil consumption with the piston rings. This is a problem with Audi mostly because it was the longitudinal engines on the A4, the A cars and up that really they had the wrong pistons in them is what it was. So that was more an Audi issue than a VW issue. That being said, we did find a handful of engines that did, the BPYs, the FSI engine that you're talking about, that did require to be re-rung and new piston rings put on. But most of the time when someone was complaining about oil consumption, it was either leaking and not consuming, it just wasn't making it all the way to the ground. So leaking, or it was being pulled through the PCV valve, which is really, really common, or that little check pipe that I mentioned as part of the campaign, or diverter valve, which it says you've already replaced. The other one is actually the valve cover. There is some valving inside of the cover itself that would cause oil to be consumed. So that's another place that you may want to look. It actually pulls it in into the intake manifold. So another place you want to look there. In addition to the piston rings, depending on the mileage and the maintenance of the car, maybe it's valve seals. I don't know. That's another thing you can look at. But first you need to determine, is it leaking or is it consuming? And then take a look at those parts that I've mentioned, PCV, valve cover, things like that, and see which way you need to go with it. If you're bringing it into a shop, they should know how to check all this stuff. This is really common, well-documented things on this engine. If they don't know about these kind of things, you may want to try and find a VW Audi specialist that maybe knows this engine a little bit better and can do some testing on it to see where your oil is going, because that is a pretty good amount of oil. Another thing that I've done on my Passat, which is a different engine but plagued with similar problems, is ran a product from BG called EPR, Engine Performance Restore, and you do this right before you change the oil. You dump the can in, start the car up, idle for 10 minutes or something like that, follow the directions on the bottle, and then do an oil change. And I saw a big reduction in oil consumption after doing that. I also saw about a 6% increase in compression after doing that. So stuff delivered on what it said. Probably going to do it again next time I do a service on my Passat. So you can try that as well and see if that makes any difference. But if you're bringing it to a shop to diagnose these problems, they should be able to pinpoint a little bit better than I can, not seeing the car, on exactly what your problem is. All right, last one of the day. I have a 13 Passat 2.5 and my AC compressor has failed for a second time. Shocking. First time I had it replaced at the dealer for $1,400. Also shocking. That was 2 years ago, and the second time I want to replace it myself, so I'm thinking I could take the car to a shop, have them empty the AC lines. So my question is about compressor oil level. Do I have to adjust the level by comparing the old compressor to the new one, or just replace the new part without any oil adjustments? Okay, so the way the repair manual is written, first of all, AC compressor failure is so common, going back to like 06. But the way the repair manual is written is, yes, you do need to drain all the oil out of the old compressor and measure it. You need to drain all the oil out of the new compressor and measure it, and put new oil back in the new compressor in the exact same amount that you drained out of the old compressor. It's a pretty easy process to do and takes a handful of minutes. Now, throughout the years, I have seen many compressors put right on and that not done. And I have seen very few issues with doing it that way. Again, officially, by the book, you need to drain and measure and put back the same amount. That is the official way. If you ask me how to do it, that is how to do it. But I have seen plenty just put back in. There's also something to consider that may help you out. Two things to consider actually while you're thinking about replacing these compressors. One, if you're going to replace the compressor, you need to do a thorough inspection after removing it of the lines. If you have a lot of gray sludge inside of the lines that come out of the compressor, or I guess one technically comes in and one goes out, if you have a lot of gray sludge in there, you need to flush the cooling system. And the way we did it at the dealerships, we had this really cool machine that flushed everything out, ran refrigerant through the cycle, and got any debris and any crud out of the lines and out of the evaporator, and sometimes out of the condenser, depending on the desiccant bag. Sometimes we replace the condenser. If you see this gray sludge and you want to do it yourself, you can. It is going to involve disconnecting all the components and flushing the lines out with something like brake clean and compressed air. Just please be careful doing this. You want to not just blast brake clean everywhere, because there's going to be oil and contaminants in the brake fluid or in the brake cleaner. You also want to be careful with things like the evaporator, not to do full bore on compressed air. You don't want to end up rupturing part of the evaporator, because that means the dash is coming out, and let's face it, nobody wants to do that. While you're doing this, it's a good idea. Replace the expansion valve and replace the receiver dryer that has a desiccant bag in it. If you pull that compressor off and you don't see a bunch of gray sludge, then you're probably good to go. Go ahead and put the new compressor in. I have seen it both ways. I have seen no sludge, just straight up compressor failure. I have seen sludge requiring flushing and that being performed, and I've seen sludge, no flushing, and then about 4 days later the compressor fails again because all that crap gets stuck in the compressor and makes it go sad. Now, there is another option to replacing that entire compressor assembly, which is actually pretty easy, by the way, especially once you get someone else to evacuate the system. there is a solenoid on the end of the compressor. Not always, but typically that's the problem. That is the source of failure. And some of those valves you can get from your VW parts department. Most of those valves you can get everywhere else from places like Worldpac, SSF. I'm sure there's a ton of websites that sell them. I might even check out Shop DAP, talk to my buddy Paul, and see if he sells the individual solenoid. Now, you still need to evacuate the system. If you take that out without doing that, you're going to get it probably, as soon as you take snap ring off, get a face full of refrigerant, which is very dangerous and we don't want to do. So you still need to evacuate the system, but swapping that valve out legit takes a minute. It'll take you longer to take the belly pan off and put it back on than it will to actually do that little solenoid. It's one plug, one snap ring, and all that holds it in. I might try that first before I crack the big bucks on a new compressor and see if that works. If you don't want to take it to get it diagnosed. If you want to take it to get it diagnosed, you can take it to the dealership. They can diagnose it as a bad compressor. You can take it to an indie shop or an aftermarket shop that knows VWs. This is an area where I don't think you have to go to a specialty shop because air conditioning is air conditioning and it all works about the same. There's some nuance that different brands have, but this is pretty straightforward. This isn't a case where I say only go to a VW Audi shop, but you need to go to a good shop, either an AC specialist shop or find a local independent VW Audi shop and take it there, which is something I recommend everybody does. Even if you're a fan of the dealer, find an indie shop nearby because there's some things a dealer's just not going to do for you, like try and find this valve. There may be dealers, don't get mad at me, there may be dealer guys out there replacing this valve, but you guys know as well as I do that's not common in the dealer world. It's mostly, give me a new compressor, I'll put it in. And there's a million reasons for that, and I understand why. It's not lazy diagnosis. We'll get into it in another video. But I would try that valve before I put a whole new compressor on, or get it diagnosed and maybe just have them do it since you're gonna pay for an evac and recharge anyway. It might be easier just to pay another 40 bucks, have them swap the valve in and out, and just get your car all done all at one time. Hopefully it doesn't need a flush, but if it does, you wanna do that flush and not just put a new compressor in because you're gonna risk damaging the new compressor, which no bueno. All right, I'm gonna wrap it up there. Questions or comments, drop them down below. If you like the video, hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe right here on YouTube and on the blog at HumbleMechanic.com. You wanna help support the show and get discounts places like Black Forest, Eastwood, MT9, Sonic Tools, Scanner, Danner, MyCanic, Prime Shave, and more. Check out the Crew membership program. I also have a Patreon if you want to hit that, or just use my Amazon link. Buy what you're going to buy. Costs you $0 to do that. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course on Snapchat. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.